Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to get started. The final portion of today's symposium, which is our keynote speaker, John Ippolito. He is a new media artist, writer, and curator whose work has been recognized with awards from the Toma, Tiffany, Lannan, and American Foundations. At the Guggenheim, he curated the first art museum exhibition of virtual reality, and he is currently professor and program coordinator of new media, co-director of the Stillwater Lab, and director of the digital curation program at the University of Maine. I'll hand it over to John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Kate and everybody who made this possible. I'm going to start with a little fire.
You're looking at a test by the National Archives in 1948 of what happens when a nitrate film storage vault gets too hot. This deliberate test was prompted by earlier accidents, most famously an 1897 fire at a charity bazaar in Paris that killed 126 members of the Parisian elite. Nitrate burns explosively because it generates oxygen as it burns. It's so hot you can actually see canisters being hurled out of the window.
Clearly, nitrate film is not what you would imagine a preservationist would consider an archival medium. Archival formats are supposed to be something that endures without volatility. Yet George Willeman, pictured there on the left, who is the film manager of the Library of Congress, which has a lot of nitrate film, loves nitrate film. He thinks it's the best medium for preserving film. He claims that it has more accuracy, more faithfulness to the original experience, and is longer lasting than the archival film formats that came afterward. What are those? So acetate film turns to vinegar in a canister. They include things like polyester safety film, which shrinks, thus rendering it unable to stick into a 35 millimeter projector and watch again. And what he says is if you keep nitrate film at the right temperature and humidity, namely, you give it the right context, then it actually outperforms all of those other media in terms of accuracy and access. So what I'd like to do is to take that kind of premise from the analog world and think about how we might apply that to the digital one. My argument is going to be that archival formats do an even worse job of preserving the important things about culture, particularly context, as we move into the digital realm. And I'm going to be drawing on themes from my book with Richard Reinhardt called Recollection, also some of the techniques we show students in the digital curation online program that we have at the University of Maine. And in the process, I'm going to ask you to prove me wrong, or at least invite ways that I might have undersold archival formats. I'm going to give you a good potshot at me because I'm going to be running 2 operating systems and 3 emulators and a VNC protocol simultaneously on the same MacBook. So it's very likely that something will go wrong, hopefully no fires. So if you think about why preservationists like archival formats, it makes sense. For centuries, since the 1700s, artists' archives have been solander boxes, flat files, climate-controlled vaults, right? And these have been the bulwarks against decay, analog bulwarks. 50 years ago, that changed. 50 years ago, suddenly we had digital counterparts invading the artist's archive, right? So you have things like stacks of boxes of VHS tapes, and you have shelves full of hard drives, and you have cloud subscriptions, and you've got all these other sort of mechanisms for keeping entropy at bay, all digital, of course. And increasingly, we see that those formats proliferate to the point where it's very hard to know how to keep them all alive. And we've seen tons of examples of this so far in this conference. So the notion of an archival format is a way of coping with this, right? Because the notion is, if I can get it into one of these kind of time-tested, standards-approved, institutionally sanctioned formats, it's got a chance of surviving. Why? Because they're universal, they're supposed to work everywhere, they're self-contained, they don't depend on other stuff, and they've also got a sort of a level of, how should I put it? They've got description wrapped around them that is usually in the form of metadata containers that can be used to sort of resurrect the original image or movie or document or whatever it was in whatever viewing kind of context will happen in the future. So the notion of an archival format, in theory, is you pull it out of a box in the future, sprinkle a little metadata and funding on it, and boom, suddenly you've got future exhibition possibilities, future scholarly research. It springs into action. I'm going to see how that works for a particular artwork. You know, in this field, we spend a lot of time talking about like generalized studies. In my institution, we have 5,000 works that we investigate, and this is our workflow. And it's not that often that we look really deeply into any one piece. And another thing that I often do in these talks is talk about other people's work. But I'm at Yale, and I actually went here as a grad student in painting, of all things. But I quickly stopped using paint and started using some more digital-oriented stuff. So I'm going to use this pretext of this nice setting in New Haven to talk about a piece that I was involved in. I will say that I applied to the Yale MFA program several times and eventually got in. But I met there two artists, Janet Cohen and Keith Frank, with whom I later did collaborations. We moved to New York, found a studio, and before long we found this thing called the internet. The internet was cool because it was hard to break into the brick and mortar sort of art world of galleries and magazine reviews. And they weren't really paying attention to this digital thing, but people online were really paying attention to it. Artists and critics were flocking to it, even if typical curators didn't. Well, there were a few curators that actually did kind of move to it. And one of them was Ben Weil, who created a site called Deweb. Deweb was famous for being a destination not just for new digitally minted artists of the internet age, but also some of the older artists who wanted to play with this new medium. So Jenny Holzer, Lawrence Weiner, there were a variety of folks who contributed to that platform. And they would do a commission every couple years, or several times a year. And Janet and Keith and I were tapped to do the next one. Well, as often happened to us as artists, force majeure, an act of God happened, or an act of AOL, which was the funder of Deweb, and pulled the plug, and that, boom, there was our commission. Fortunately, though, the site was important enough historically that another curator, Steve Dietz, at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, said, hey, we don't want this piece to die. I'll host the files for you. So Deweb jumped from its parent company of AOL over to the Walker Arts Study Center, which was a publicly available website. Now, Steve was smart. He said, I know that just copying over files is something as precarious as web code isn't just going to preserve them for the future. So we need to think about this a little more. And he knew that my artistic collaborators and I were very interested in alternative forms of preservation. So he said, why don't you guys do the piece you were going to do, except do it about the archiving of Deweb? And we said, fine. The result was something called the Unreliable Archivist. And it's a work that was based on the original site, Deweb, which I'll show you here in a moment, which was one of those crazy 1990s net art sites where it took a while to find your way around. There were all these sort of random-looking projects here and there that had all these different elements that looked often like they were sort of collaged together. So we looked at that and we said, what could we possibly do with that? And then we realized that that was maybe its defect was also an advantage, in that we could pick and choose elements from the site and put them together however we wanted. This was something that I was influenced by other net artists at the time who were exploring alternatives to the page-based model of the internet, right? When you just started going on, it was like, oh, I have a web page. I have you have 2 web pages. Oh, great, you've got 2 web pages. No one talked about sites or interactivity. But it was clear that even for something that looked like the New York Times front page, if you knew anything about the internet, you knew that all of those images and texts and code and everything came from different places on the server and often different routes to the internet to get to you, and were only assembled into this seamless page by the time it actually arrived on your screen. So that meant that we were doing a disservice to the world to sort of pretend that the web was just a bunch of paper pages. So we took those two things, the fact that the site had this kind of collage-like structure, as well as our interest in exposing the non-pageness of the internet, and we put them together into this project called the Unreliable Archivist. Because the premise was that this archivist had kind of mixed up some of the files and which went with which projects on the way to the browser. I'll show you the idea was that we knew there were different components. There were text, there was images, there was layout, there was style. There were also different sort of appearances. This is not a standard Dublin core category, by the way, but plain, enigmatic, loaded, and preposterous, that's what we sort of categorize the majority of the site as. So we said, if we can capture all those things and create essentially a bunch of sliders, options for people to make the site what they want. Do you want to look at an enigmatic project? Do you want to look at a preposterous project? Do you want to focus on certain images or for certain layouts? Then that would give our users, the viewers, the chance to create their ideal AdaWeb, their ideal kind of composite version of the site. So we needed a technology to do that. Obviously, it was going to use the web and HTML. But it took a while for us to figure out what it was going to be until Netscape 4 came along. Netscape 4 was amazing because it had this thing called a layer tag. And a layer tag meant you could actually separate all your images and overlap them, which before you couldn't do that. You could hide them, show them, move them kinetically across a page. So we were like, yes, we're going to use the layer tag and make something with Netscape 4. Sadly, Netscape 4's layer tag didn't last very long. It was a sort of proprietary standard, which is to say it wasn't a standard, that Netscape came up with on its own. And remember, this is the Wild West of the web, so there's no W3C at that point, or if there was, they didn't have much influence over web browser makers, which would just sort of do what they wanted. And before long, the layer tag lost ground to another tag. And this tag was, I don't know if it was better, but it was easier to use. It was more quickly adopted. The browser that it came with was awesome. It was shiny. It was fast. It was new. We all loved it. It was called Internet Explorer. How times have changed. So very quickly, this project that we built using the layer tag died thanks to Internet Explorer. Thank you, Microsoft. And we wondered what to do. This project that we had done basically on the topic of the trickiness of archiving web materials online became its own punchline. Right? The Unreliable Archivist turned out to be totally unreliable. The project was kind of dead in the water. And you might say to yourself, well, save it, right? And then hope someone in the future would preserve it, keep it going in some way or another, which we tried to do. So the first thing you do when you try to save a website is save the code locally, which we did. And then you try eventually, like here in 2018, load it in a current browser. So here's Firefox with the original version. This is actually the kind of frame that the Walker had. But you can see already that something is missing. Over here on the left, that was a Flash plugin, which is not by nature default anymore. Flash is disappearing. At 1998, Flash had been around for about a year. It was an exciting, cutting-edge new technology. Everyone was about to invest in it. Now, 20 years later, it's literally the anniversary of the death of this thing. Flash is disappearing from the world for a number of reasons, including insecurity and Apple not running it on iPads and that sort of thing. So when you actually say, oh, well, I'm just going to run the actual application here, what opens is a disaster. All of these little things are layer tags, which means they're completely incomprehensible to a contemporary browser. You can't click on anything. You can't do squat. It's a total wreck. So that's what you get when you just try running the original URL in a contemporary browser. All right? Well, you could say to yourself, well, that's OK, John. You can save stuff, right? You saved it on the server. Why don't you just save it to your desktop? Well, that's not going to help. Yes, every browser has like a save page as, and you get a web archive. But the code hasn't changed. So that original deprecated code that doesn't work anymore is still not going to work in a current browser. So what to do? Well, this is where you might say, of course, any archivist would know if you save something in some weird proprietary, untested format, it's going to go bad eventually. You needed to save it in an archival format. That would have made things work. OK, let's try saving it in an archival format. Where do we find these things? Well, the National Archives has a pretty good description of digital file types for preservation. This is what they use. Looking through, nothing really for websites, but it does say for images, you can use JPEG or TIFF. Now, you can go ahead and save this website as TIFF. TIFF, everybody knows, is an archival format. Obviously, that's kind of ridiculous, right? Because all of the interactivity will be lost, just as it was in the kind of version that I tried to open in the browser itself. But that didn't stop people in 1997 from trying. So a certain museum that I won't name, the Architecture and Design Department decided it would be a good idea to start collecting websites. But they didn't know how. So they took screenshots and saved them on CD-ROM. OK, CD-ROMs, we now know, have a lifespan of about 5 years if you burn them yourself. But hopefully someone at the museum has kind of moved them along from one medium to another over the time. The problem is that, obviously, this, even at the time, was ridiculed by critics and artists who said, that's not preserving a website. You preserved an image of a website. It's a lot like walking around with a photograph of a fire extinguisher in case you ever get caught in a burning house. Not going to help, right? So that idea that, well, we're going to depend on CD-ROMs is really not very helpful. So how about we move from images to, oh, look, PDFs, my favorite. So PDFs. PDFs are the go-to archival format of preservationists. You know they're always going to look the same. They don't change. If you want to get fancy, there's PDF-A, which has embedded fonts and no encryption and standard, ISO standard that everyone can adapt. Great. Let's do PDFs. Well, here's what happens, and you'll not be surprised if you worked on the web, when you try loading the Unreliable Archivist as a PDF. What? OK, some things, if you know that it's a PDF, you know you're going to get like this weird header at the bottom, and 1 of 1. That's very helpful. But also, what the heck happened? These are random pictures at random sizes, and then it outed a random JavaScript comment. What is that? Obviously, it's not navigable, and you can't click on it, or it's got this weird size of a letter page instead of 800 by 600. But it's also this JavaScript comment out of nowhere. You never even saw that on the site. It's like a bone protruding from a compound fracture, right? What is it doing there? What are you doing, PDF? You were supposed to rescue me. So obviously, that's not ideal for something like a complex software object. And I know that PDFs are a favorite of people in the world of digital preservation. So I'm expecting some objections. Objection number 1, you're not saving it right. I said save as PDF. Maybe there's some utility that really saves more interactive potential in PDFs. It would be great if there were. I don't know of one. If you know of one, let me know. Objection number 2, well, PDFs capture the salient properties. They don't capture every property. All right, but the position of a word on a page and its typeface is maybe a salient property for Microsoft Word documents. Certainly isn't scratching the surface for something like Unreliable Archivist. All right, what else have we got? Well, objection number 3, PDFs preserve most websites, not your weird, artsy, funky one. OK, maybe in 1994, most websites were pages that just looked the same when you saw them on a screen as when you print them out. Don't get me wrong, PDFs are great for print, right? Scan something, look at a PDF, do OCR, great. But most websites these days, in fact, the trend over the last 20 years has been to make them less like pages, right? They may look like pages on the outside, but what you're getting is on-demand content that's changing all the time. So you go to Twitter, you go to Facebook, you go to Instagram, you're seeing information that's added on the fly. There is no fully loaded page. You will never get a fully loaded page. It's more like a JavaScript armature that accretes more text and images and content as you interact with it and other people update their information. We'll look at that in a little more detail in a moment. Objection 4. Well, they save most electronic documents, maybe not the web. OK. Again, I think you're really overselling the way that PDFs work with electronic documents. So I had a colleague recently send me a a research paper. He was like, hey, I'd like some comments on this in line, if you don't mind. I was like, sure. He sent it to me as PDF. I had Acrobat Pro. It took me 20 minutes of regular expressions to pull something readable out of it, right? And I looked online like, OK, is there some way that I can get the text out of here more easily, right? And I'm exporting from Acrobat Pro. I'm talking about like the actual like proprietary software that this thing is built in. Because let's face it, Adobe owns the patent to PDFs. So I was like, well, let's find some other technique. Well, I found something helpful online. Use a hex editor. No, I'm not doing that just to get text out of something that's supposed to preserve text. I don't think so. The worst example of this that I've seen is this recent study out of the Netherlands, a proposal that PDFA would be a preferred sustainable format for spreadsheets. OK, so spreadsheets are usually used for tabular data, right? For like scientific data or data that comes in from a probe or a sensor or something. You're going to take that and put it in PDF? Well, how's anyone going to operate on those data? How are they going to manipulate them? How are they going to add things and check to see if the data really do what you say they are? It's basically like printing out a photocopy of it. Save it as comma-separated text, and you can actually do something with it. And it's much easier than kind of trying to reverse engineer a PDF. The last objection, anything but HTML. HTML is crazy. Like, that's crazy talk to preserve stuff in HTML. You yourself, John, said that deprecated HTML was the reason your project died. OK, I accept that. But then what is the archival format for HTML? Well, NARA doesn't leave one on their page, but Library of Congress says work, which is not surprising. Those of you who've done web archiving, work files are basically HTTP requests that are saved to your server wrapped in some metadata. Problem is, work files are still a variation with metadata of the thing you get when you save a browser, kind of save your page from a browser, right? A work file is not going to magically turn layer tags into div tags. So you're screwed either way. OK, so PDF, no, sorry. And not even another option like work. So what are we going to do instead? Well, migrate. That's the fantasy of migration. Here's the reality of migration. And my favorite. So for the record, I did migrate the site. I started in 2010. I said, OK, I'm going to get this. I know this. W3C has come out with standards. There's HTML5. Everyone agrees on it. All major browsers support it. I'll just switch those layer tags into div tags. Oh, it wasn't that easy, right? Because it required me to change the structure. It wasn't just those tags. It was all the HTML had to change from Netscape HTML to W3C HTML. I had to do a new skin for it because the style didn't work. All the images were wrong sizes and wrong position. So I had to create a new style sheet to match the new HTML structure. I had to change the behavior. I had some scripts that were written in Dreamweaver. What was I thinking? It puts out this obfuscated code that's hard for anybody to understand. So I had to custom write completely new JavaScript objects to handle the transitions and stuff. And even the environment changed. It's something you don't usually think about. But at the time, I don't know what I was thinking, but I was on a Windows 95 machine. And I said, oh, I'm having trouble keeping up with all these images. But some of them are really small. And all of those, I'll just put a dot in front of it. That way, they'll go to the top of the file hierarchy. Well, that worked in Windows. But as soon as it went over from a Windows server somewhere in the late 90s to a Linux server, ooh, dot means invisible file, right? So all those images just poof, disappeared. So all of those things are part. I'm not going to go into any further in the weeds than that. But it was just a really painful process to do that migration. Did it work? Well, I don't think it's too bad. If I go over to, let's see, where is my version? OK, here we go. So this is a 2010 version. It took me longer than 2010 because it's several years. I'm still even working on it now. But this is pretty much what it looked like. So this is the version in W3, in basically HTML5, current standards. And this is sort of what you saw when you first went to the page. And then you had this option of changing things. So you could change like the language. That's plain. This is enigmatic. Again, this is drawn from actual text of the site. There was loaded text. Where do you feel safe? Preposterous. Domestic activity is sculpture and a means of empowerment. What? Then there's, the images could range from enigmatic to loaded to preposterous. The style also could change this way. I could change a lot of different pieces all at once. The layout, I could make it all, enigmatic, or I could go totally preposterous. So anyway, all these things are actually drawn from the site. So it works. It was just really painful. So it was like, well, could I have done it any other way? Was there another approach that would have saved me the pain and suffering of going through the migration? And I think some people would say, well, John, you're dealing with a worst case scenario here, right? Some weird funky like net art from the 90s. So migration in general wouldn't be that bad. Well, I don't know. I mean, we're talking about complex software here, and I accept that makes it difficult. But for me, in terms of looking at my work, my oeuvre, it was the best case scenario. I had the support of the other two artists. We had obviously the rights to the work. We were our own technicians. We didn't have to depend on someone kind of figuring out what we did. We had to figure out what we did ourselves. And it was open code. In any browser, you can just go up and hit View Source, and you can see JavaScript and HTML right there. It wasn't like a compiled format. A lot of the other things I did in that period were like Flash or Gulp Director, right? Try finding the authorware files for those. You have to reverse engineer them. So for me, this was a best case scenario, and yet the migration was super painful. So, OK, what can we do instead? What we can do instead is this. Emulation. This is an exhibition called Seeing Double that I curated with Caitlin Jones and Carol Stringari at the Guggenheim in 2004. The idea was to see if emulation would work as a preservation strategy. Jeff Rothenberg, well-known computer scientist at RAND, had proposed this in a Scientific American article earlier, and we wanted to see if it would actually work for art. So we paired artworks of the original medium, often on its last legs, some analog Laserdisc players and ancient 1982 computers next to an emulated version. And then we had user survey and asked them, how well did the new emulated version capture the spirit of the original? Now, emulation means a software program that impersonates an older computer on a new computer, thus allowing the new computer to run the older code that shouldn't run on the new computer. And a nice thing about emulation is the way it handles everything for you. It's hard to build an emulator, but once you get one, you have a number of advantages. Fortunately, I have a ringer in the audience. Ewan Cochran works here at Yale. Klaus Reichert works at the University of Freiburg. They often collaborate with Dragan Espenschede at Rhizome. Jason Scott at the Internet Archive. There's a bunch of different people working on the problem of emulation. And what they've managed to do is what Ewan mentions here. The only currently practical solution for preserving access to archived websites, he's mentioning websites, but I think it applies to a lot of stuff, as you'll see, is to maintain old web browsers and access them using those browsers running on emulated software or hardware. And you'll notice it says Ewan Cochran Easy Project. This is a big reveal. This is a project coming up at Yale. It's very exciting. You'll hear more about it as the time goes on. But again, notice that pun, easy. Let's see if we can actually make it easy. Again, I promised you that I'd have a bunch of emulators running at the same time, so hopefully I won't screw things up. OK, starting emulator. So this is emulation not on a file directly on my computer, which you can do, and which is how your niece plays Donkey Kong at night on her PC. This is emulation running in a browser, right? And that's Windows 98 running on some other server that I just happen to be running in some random Firefox window. You should hear the boing here. OK, so a little delay because it's running far away. This is probably on a server in Freiburg or somewhere in Germany. And yet I'm accessing it over the internet. You also see, oh, John, it gave you an error. Well, it gave me an error because it's trying to find some Netscape page that it can't find on the internet because Netscape doesn't exist anymore. But if I say OK, and I go over to type in my page. So now this is the same URL that I typed into Firefox before that totally broke. But I'm not typing it in Firefox. I'm typing it in Netscape 4 in Firefox. So this is a version of, you recognize that beautiful teal background. This is Windows 98 running Netscape 4 circa 1998. And let's see what happens. Enter. There we go. So that's the Walker's website. And look, the Flash is running. Because why? Because Flash used to run on Windows 98 in Netscape 4, as long as you had the plugin installed, which everybody did. So, OK, I've got some things I didn't have before. Let's see if the actual project works. I'll get rid of this little navigator toolbar, which people don't have anymore. Click on that. OK, it opened up in a pop-up. Another thing that people don't do anymore is allow pop-ups. But they did back then. OK, here's the big moment. Yay! There we go. Boom. That's now loaded. Let's make the style preposterous. Yes, let's make it preposterous. All right, internet is slow right now. But it's working. And there's a number of things that are working well about it. One of them is that I've got certain things that you wouldn't necessarily notice if you hadn't known what the site was like originally. For example, if I go back to the original setting, it's probably easiest to see. The fonts are very hard-edged, like kind of crisp. And they're smaller and different. The color's different. And that's because they were. And until I saw this emulated version, I forgot that. I forgot that fonts got soft at a certain point when OS X changed them to be more anti-aliased. I also forgot that the colors were more limited. Not quite 256, but it wasn't the kind of bazillion colors you have now in the operating system. I forgot about that teal background of Windows 98. And I actually forgot to finish some of the project, which is the part where you see view sources. So I can click on this. And this was the idea that someone, even though they had been a kind of a process of detangling the original works and then showing them again in a new setting, I wanted to see that you could go back and find this stuff from the original site. And so you could click on the links, and it would show you the original context in which, say, that couch image appeared. And that was something that I hadn't finished in the migrated version. But of course, it's there in the original version, because why would I ever take it out? So it's now loading the page from AdaWeb that had that original image in it. There we go. So, and like I said, it was a preposterous site. So not everything's perfect, right? OK, it was working very smoothly earlier today. But now that you're all looking at me, it's going slow. You'll notice that the cursor lags. That often happens with these online browsers. It's not really a big issue unless you're playing a game or something. Really, though, it's remarkable that this is possible at all. I didn't have to do anything to do this. All I did was say, hey, Ewan and Klaus, could you make me an emulator? Just give me an instance of your emulator that you already have running on a server. And all I did, they said, here you go. And I just took the browser and I pointed to the existing code. So in one fell swoop, it's preserved, right? Emulators have other advantages too. One of the other things about emulators is that when you run an emulator, you might have written it for one particular purpose. Like, I wanted to run Unreliable Archivist. Well, it turns out that AdaWeb as a whole was pretty much written for Netscape 4. And it also works in the emulator, of course, because it's the same browser, same period. In fact, not just any website, but any application that ran on that chip, namely Windows 98 Pentium or whatever it is, that's going to run on this emulator too. So you may have made an emulator to play games, say, but as a byproduct, you get emulators that run accounting software, artist websites, old databases, all kinds of stuff. You basically get all of that for free because you're emulating the operating system as a whole. There's even more cool stuff about emulators. And I'm going to try to show you one now with another running emulator. I think I'll kill this one first. OK. So I'm running a Windows emulator right now in Mac. Technically, it's virtualization, but it's the same idea. So this is Windows 10 running in OS 10. This is just off-the-shelf stuff you can buy for a couple $100 or whatever. And you can run, you love Internet Explorer, you can use it on a Mac. But what I like to do is something Jeff Rothenberg suggested to me, which is to actually run another emulator inside this emulator. This is the EDSAC emulator. It was one of the very first computers, 1949, an English emulator, an English computer that had like mercury delay tubes and this oscilloscope readout, and you accessed it by literally like a dial. And it couldn't do a whole lot by compared to today's iPhone, of course. But for 1949, it was pretty cool. So for example, of course, it wants to install updates. That shows you that this is a real copy of Windows 10. So let's start the program. So this is noughts and crosses, which is the British term for tic-tac-toe. And it's loading. My understanding is that this part it actually did speed up, because otherwise it would take forever. I'm going to play player 1. So I'm going to hit the dial here. There we go. And I'm going to pick move. Now you notice up here in this output area, it says like 9, 8, 7, da da da. Those are different spots that I can choose on this oscilloscope, tic-tac-toe board. I'm going to choose 5. So 5, boom. There we go. Oh, it already chose something else. I think I'll choose 7. Oh, it blocked me. But you can see that that's kind of fun. You can play this old computer, simulator from 1949. Obviously, the computer's 1949. The simulator was written to work for Windows. But again, as a reminder, I'm running this emulator for the EDSAC inside of Windows, which itself is emulated within the Mac environment, right? So I've got basically a chain of emulators going on here. And if I go back to my kind of the way you can think about this, each of them is a different sort of system within another system. And although there's some disadvantages of this, it holds out a nice promise, which is that in theory, you could daisy chain these emulators into the long-term future. Now, let's suppose that Mac OS 10 is dead in 30 years, and there's some new super cool operating system. Well, if that happens, you could then run an OS 10 emulator in that operating system, and then run the Windows emulator in that operating system, and then run EDSAC inside Windows. So you keep daisy chaining them together and create this kind of telescoping preservation chain into the future. And the great thing is, you haven't done any extra work. All you've done is basically chain together emulators that already existed, and now you've covered 100 years with no extra work. That's very different from migration. Every time you migrate, you don't gain a lot except maybe war wounds and emotional scarring, right? Every time you start anew, you pretty much have to start from square one. But if you build a good emulator and you nest it like this, in theory, you could build on that in the future. And you don't have to go back and emulate what was there in the past. So that's a really cool kind of promise that emulators might hold for the future. Now, I've talked about artworks. What about archives? That's also part of this conversation. And yes, we talk about artworks, but we also talk about the ephemera of artists, their photographs, their journals, their email, all that good stuff. Do emulators help with that? Well, let's go back and look at migration again. You can take that archival format approach, and you can say, all right, let's see, I've got email in first class, OK? I'm going to migrate that to an archival format. I'll put it in Mbox, right? Mbox is basically like a big text file with metadata in it and all the email messages, content sort of stuffed in there. Let's see, what else do I have? I've got some GIFs, right? OK, I'm going to emulate those, or I'm going to migrate those to TIFFs, right? And I'll put those in this other part of the archive. And you would divide up an artist's hard drive, say, into all different kind of pieces and kind of make them go wherever you want them to go. Well, that's an approach that a lot of people do. A lot of archives take that approach because they're thinking in terms of, I want everything in an archival format. But what does that do? It separates everything into disconnected parts. It also is a lot more work, right? You have to do each of those tasks separately for whatever parts of the archive that you're willing to migrate. It also makes it inaccessible. You've taken something that you could see altogether on a screen, and you've put them in forms like TIFF. OK, I have one application on my hard drive that can run TIFF. If they were GIFs, God, I could open them in almost anything, right? You can open a GIF in Microsoft Word. You can open it in Twitter. I mean, it's universal, right, in that way, accessible. Same with some of the other archival formats. What else? It destroys connections. There's no context anymore. If I've got an mbox file with all the emails in it, how does that relate to the attachments? How does that relate to the calendar data that says what that person was doing the day that they sent that email? How does the GIF that's now a TIFF somewhere that used to be attached to the certain message, how do I make those connections? I got to weave this elaborate web of metadata to kind of somehow capture all those relationships that are lost because I separated them all into archival formats. What's the option? The option is emulating the whole damn hard drive, right? OK, maybe not useful for every artist. They may have different documents in different places and some stuff on their phone, whatever. And certainly if you have analog items and you have to digitize it, it's a little harder. But as the world moves forward, we're talking about artists delivering hard drives, an entire computer to your archive, right? It's already happened with Salman Rushdie's papers, which are all on a hard drive on a computer. It's also happened to Willem Flusser's hard drive. And thanks to the good folks at BWFLA at the University of Freiburg, they emulated the entirety of Willem Flusser, the famous media theorist's hard drive. And you can go to his hard drive online and look around in all the nooks and crannies. You can see what was his file structure, what was his desktop background, which emails did he send when. Technically, I think his hard drive was before emails, but he was working on like hypercard stacks and that sort of thing. So it's a lot like in those movies when someone surreptitiously sneaks into an office at night and hacks into someone's computer and figures out the password. That's what it feels like. It's like looking in their digital brain. You've got access to the relationships that that person made in their life and their creative output. How could you ask for something better than that, right? And it's also something that, if you want, you can make accessible online. Now, again, Flusser was here before Instagram and Twitter and all these other social media that artists today might be using to document their work, right? Tons of artists are on Instagram using that as one of their major platforms for documenting what they do, their installations, and so on. It's great if you have access to Instagram because it's got timestamp data, it's got the people who commented on it, it's this whole network of associations. Problem is, Instagram's not going to be around forever. So what are you going to do about that? Well, again, the problem is these websites aren't the kind of thing you can hit save as. And if I go to, I just loaded the is this permanence hashtag in Twitter. And I just want to point out something to you. Mac doesn't make it easy to see, but at the upper right is the scroll bar, right? Everybody see the scroll bar? OK, watch that scroll bar. I'm going to scroll to the bottom of this page in Twitter. OK, now I'm at the bottom. Whoop. Oh, wait a minute. OK, that's not the bottom. Let's try again. Now I'm at the bottom. Oh, whoop. Wait, the scroll bar is getting smaller, and I can't get to the damn bottom of the page. Why? Because it's like I said before. Current web pages are JavaScript armatures that accrete more and more information and data and images and text as you interact with them. There is no bottom to this page. When you get to the bottom of the page, let's open a little web inspector here to look at the console to see what's going on. If we click on network, you'll see these little messages that say, oh, you're actually getting more information. See all that stuff come in? is not necessarily visible because when you scroll, it just seems to happen automatically. But all of these kind of references down here to AJAX calls are JavaScript going back to the server and saying, hey, they want more information, bring it directly to the page. So this kind of stuff is very hard to emulate, right? It's hard if you're not working with a set document. And again, I'm assuming Twitter is gone. It's the ideal world. And it's 2030, and we all live happily now. So what do you do about that? Well, thankfully, Ilya Kramer and Dragan Espenshida, I mentioned earlier, have an idea. It's called Web Recorder. And what Web Recorder does is it gives you a little interface that you can put in a URL and name a recording session. And you're essentially performing the archive. You go around clicking on things, revealing things, maybe going to the bottom of the page, maybe rolling over certain videos so they play. And every time you activate one of those things, Web Recorder will save the HTTP request, all those little lines of code that you saw earlier, onto a special space that you can go back and review. Now, it's kind of like in front of a foggy window, you're moving your hand and you can see things that you wipe off. If you don't wipe off the lower right corner, you're not going to see it. Okay? So it doesn't capture everything. It captures what you explore, what you're interested in. But it's a really nifty tool for thinking about how we can preserve these works. And once they are in that form, once they are in a work file, then you can emulate that with no problem. So essentially, even though it's dependent on a social media service that you don't control, you can still bring that under the emulation envelope. And again, think of it as emulation is not just easy and great for all these other technical reasons, but because it brings the context with it. It's a way of thinking about the archive not as a bunch of disconnected fragments, but as something that is connected, is preserving those original relationships that really art historians are going to love to see. They're going to want to know how, Robert Wilson's email on such a date related to an image that someone else sent to him that he saved in a certain folder in a hard drive with a certain name. And all this sort of investigation is going to be so much potential for discovering meaning and learning more about the artistic process because of that. So I'd like to just remind you that everything's turning into software. I know I've focused on websites, but movies are software now. They're networked objects, right? They participate in an exchange of comments and forwarding and streaming on social media. So we really, if we focus on only the things that work really well for archival formats, it's like the old joke of the person who sees his friend looking around under a street lamp, and he says, what are you doing? He says, I'm looking for my keys. Did you lose them there? No, but the light's better here. Right? We can't do that with our culture. We can't just preserve the few things that work, that fit into PDF or whatever other formats. We have to think about a more holistic way to produce that. And we need to think about how we can make the liveliness of our archive match the liveliness of the work that it archives. And I like a certain quote. Jean Cocteau is a story I read once. He was asked the one thing he would save if his very valuable art collection caught on fire. And his answer was the fire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really illuminating. Now we're opening up the floor for questions. I'm sure we have a lot of them. I wanted to start with a question that I personally have, and it's, so at what point does digital art preservation stop being slowly a tech and a hardware questions? And I'm especially thinking of works that are user-driven and have a performative aspect, such as augmented reality native apps. So what strategies do we enact to make sure that we're not, zombifying unique art objects?
That we're not what?
Zombifying.
Zombifying?
Zombifying, like a zombie, yeah.
Okay. So virtual reality and augmented reality are really new concerns in the world of preservation, right? Mm-hmm. New media, I actually curated a show in 1993 of virtual reality, yeah. So it comes and goes, but we're in one of these orbits now where it's very close to our attention. I think that in the past, the problem has been, and the present, has been largely proprietary systems.
Okay.
That is, we're stuck with these vendors that are producing things like Netscape 4 was back in the day with the layer tag. They just come out with something that said, this is what we're going to do, right? And what's happened with the web over time is it's marched more or less inexorably toward transparent formats. Mm-hmm. So that makes it much easier to preserve because I've got access to the code. Silicon graphics computers were the heyday of artistic VR, from my opinion. It was, the early 90s, and you had artists like Shar Davies and John Klima and Golan Levin working in that format. But when that company died, there was no way to access the original code that they ran on. It was quite difficult to run an emulator under those circumstances. And the software that was used to build those, like World 8, for example, that company went bankrupt. And because it was closed source, there's no way to go in and fix it or reverse engineer it. It's really, really a tough problem. So there are some advantages that augmented reality, for example, has in that it essentially can live on a server and be ported to different phones. And as soon as you have a system that can work on multiple devices, it's more likely to be preserved if you accept that variability. But I think the current young state of the industry and the fact that it's really tied into proprietary software is a real problem. I don't know what to do. Maybe some of you do.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, over there.
I was just curious, can you manipulate documents that are in an emulator, or are they frozen, like in time?
No, you can change them. You can go in and do anything, almost anything you could do in the original operating system. So you could start a new note, you could type in it, you could open Photoshop and play with Photoshop and mech paint or something. That's one of the reasons people love emulators. It's one thing to go back and say, oh, here's a movie I saw when I was 10. But now I can actually go in and say, oh, look, Mac SE30. Oh my God, I remember this. And oh, remember the fonts? You get a charcoal. I remember that font. Like, that's part of the fun of it.
Yes, thanks. Great talk. Are the emulators licensed by the original software designers, by the original Windows or Netscape owners?
Short answer is no, right? So different companies take different approaches or different, let's say, attitudes toward the legality of emulators. Nintendo, for example, is notoriously litigious about everything. And if you go to the Nintendo website, under their FAQs, there's a whole section on emulators, which I checked a month ago or so, and it still says, emulators represent the biggest threat to the intellectual property of game developers in the history of mankind, or something like that. But in reality, there are there is certainly a kind of market competition for a company like Nintendo, which will sort of issue its older games in new skins. And if people could just play the old games, then why would they play the new ones? Well, there's still some incentive, but you can see that they have some market competition there. But for a lot of these companies and a lot of these other organizations, the people who work there actually want to preserve the culture. So they kind of turn a blind eye to emulation. And also, honestly, a lot of emulators, the majority of emulators, 90% of emulators have been written by fans in their bedrooms at night, right? Mm-hmm. They're not written by a company that's got anyone to sue. They just post the emulators online in that sort of anonymous but very social way that John Bell talked about in self-archiving communities. And then people download it and they evaluate it and they often make it better. Emulators are an incredible example of this sort of homebrew, open source, community-based software development. It's really remarkable. But because there's, it's not that likely that there's someone to sue, it makes it less of an obvious target. I wasn't in a meeting recently with someone who is a preservationist at a major game company, and he said that he has personally a heck of a time getting the company to realize that what they're producing is culturally relevant and important and should be preserved. So he was totally in favor of fair use of other people using their material for historical benefit. But don't come to me if you get sued. Basically, I don't know of any case law where someone has been sued have actually gone to court for either developing or using an emulator. Hey.
Have you been thinking about as our runtime experiences move to cloud-based services and API-driven things that we have no idea what is behind them, what that means? I mean, obviously, we're, for the last 20 years, have been in a very OS-centric, if not 50, you could argue, a very OS and machine-centric world. But as we move more into a service-oriented world, what's that mean for the world of emulation?
It's a challenge. I mean, I'm not sure if anyone has, I'm sure probably Klaus and Ewan have thought more about this than I have, and we might ask them. I would only say that web recorder that I showed you before gives you one example of when you depended on a service that doesn't even have like a file. There's literally no file that represents a document. There are still ways to sort of represent that locally and go back and emulate that. But does anyone else want to take on that easy softball question? I think we're still working on it.
Hi, my question is relates to this and the other panels earlier, which is a lot of what I hear from you are the same issues that I hear in the social science world around research reproducibility. And so I'm wondering if you've ever been a part of that conversation, or how you can sort of take this into an interdisciplinary approach of just how do we preserve, digital work.
Right. Well, I think that's the benefit of, if you can preserve artwork, you can preserve anything. It's the acid test, because it depends on the look and feel, right? So we are often more attuned to every little detail that we want to get right. Gamers too, they're obsessed with pacing and characters and so forth. But I think if you consider that larger kind of sphere of digital creativity, we tend to be the ones who are pushing the envelope, trying the weirdest things, trying to capture those things. I mean, like you could say, like, well, why did you even go out for that layer tag? Why didn't you wait a year and see that it was going to be the div tag? Well, it's like in the DNA of artists, right? We're always pushing ourselves to, kind of look at the horizon, to flirt with disaster, to build on, rickety stilts a house that overlooks a cliff because we want a view of the horizon, right? So we can take advantage of that and kind of reflect back on some of the other fields that might benefit. So as one example, in this digital curation program that I run, it's an online program to grad students all over the world. One woman works in documenting genocide for international legal proceedings. And for her, she has a completely different reason to be interested in preservation, right? Which is to bring evidence to court. And she has to prove that the evidence is faithful, not just in like, okay, this looks like the artwork and I think it captured the artist's spirit. It's like faithful, like it's going to convince a jury and a judge. So some of the techniques that we use for establishing fidelity work for her too. Because as soon as you migrate, it's like a telephone game. It's just going to change a little bit over time. Ewan Cochran has done a great study of how opening a WordStar document in later a WordPerfect or Microsoft Word changes really fundamental things about that document, right? And that would be true in the social sciences or any field where evidence matters. So emulation gives you a chance to say, well, here's what the original environment was of that artifact. So if you really need to go back and prove that that is evidentially valid, emulation seems like a win.
Hi, John. Thanks. I always enjoy hearing about the migration versus emulation deathmatch in digital preservation. It's always fun. I'm really interested in notions of quality and trust. Can you say something about how one can check the quality of an emulation, particularly in those evidential roles that you were just discussing there?
Right. I guess having worked with emulators a bit, I trust that they're operating like the original system because you can do anything in them that you could do in the original system. Now, I suppose there could be some like system-wide deviation from, I don't know, how the original font looked, or I don't know, maybe a character gets mangled in the encoding process. But this happens constantly in migration. There's always things that change and look different. So the reason that I trust emulation is it performs. It works. I can do almost anything in it that I did in the original environment. And that gives me a faith that If I can do some random thing by pull down menus and opening an app and saving something and performing work there, then probably the rest of it's working functionally too. And that may be faith.
And does that require your human presence to compare? Because obviously human memory is valuable as well, right? So. Sure.
I mean, obviously I'm evaluating that based on my nostalgic memory of what that thing was. And you will also find that emulators have settings. They're not like a vanilla kind of default that's always the same. It's not neutral. The best emulators, for example, you can choose the pace. So my understanding is that EDSAC emulator, even though it seemed to take forever for the computer to reply with its tic-tac-toe choice, was actually speeded up by like a factor of 10 or something, because these mercury delay tubes and everything take forever to process this analog signal. You can change the resolution with certain emulators. You can change the appearance of the screen from a CRT to a vector-based screen or to something that's like a contemporary flat screen. Some of them can interpolate an image and make it better resolution than it was before. You can play it at full screen. You can play it at the original resolution, which is some tiny 300 by 200 for some of these games. So it is true that emulators have parameters that can be tweaked. And you could try to influence someone perhaps by changing the parameter appropriately. So emulators are never pure and rarely simple, but they're so much more powerful than many of the other preservation techniques that I think it's really worth investigating them despite those pretty minor flaws.
It seems like emulators have a lot of potential for artist records, particularly when talking about being able to see how a hard drive was or how an artist thought and use their records. So my question is, why do you think that this hasn't been more widely adapted yet? And you may have answered part of this in the last question about authenticity and evidence, but what are the major roadblocks to making these more commonplace and more widely used?
Good question. It has nothing to do with authenticity. It has to do with silos and elitism. Okay? Emulators are by far the most common preservation mechanism in the history of the world. They've just not been used in museums and archives and libraries. They've been used by gamers. And they came out in the 80s, roughly speaking, in terms of their sort of widespread adoption. As I said, gamers across the internet have passed them back and forth and forked them and merged them back again. There's been a tremendous amount of finesse and fussiness about getting them exactly right. There's been this enormous sort of like preservational attention spent on games because people love games. And honestly, Jens-Peter Lobel, a German researcher, did a study of mentions of emulators in the academic literature. So this is research literature. This is not out in the world. And 90% of them were fan-made. I think there's like 5% of them were made in an academic institution, and another 5% were made by corporations, something like that. So we're talking about a system where people just didn't think that a bunch of amateurs could produce the greatest instrument of preservation in the 21st century, and yet they have. So that's a elitist thing, and it's starting to change. It's changing because people who are really inventive pioneers are trying to convince folks that the ways that they've got this kind of solidity, inertness, disconnection, that doesn't have to be the way that we do preservation. We can exploit what other people, what amateurs have built for the professionals, and we can be perfectly happy with that.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. Hey, John. So, you've mentioned nostalgia and familiarity and this moment of like where the emulator runs for the first time, and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot it looked that way. And that all of that experience is very much dependent on your own personal familiarity with the original environment. I'm curious, when we think about that like daisy chain scenario, or really just like 50 years generally in the future, when people accessing an old system, 50 years old, through an emulator, have never even seen that OS before. and this is an experience I've had where trying to, sorry, I'm going to try not to make a statement. I'll just finish the question. My question is, what do you see as happening there in the future when the people running these emulations actually don't know how to use the operating system that they've successfully emulated?
Right. That's a great question. You may have seen the YouTube video of like Photoshop experts try to use Photoshop 1.
No.
It's hysterical. And we could run into that problem, right? I guess I would say it's a great issue and a genuine concern down the road. I would say that the alternatives are that we are unconscious of that ignorance, right? So if we've gotten a file that's been migrated or some application that's been migrated over the past, every 10 years for the last 50 years, we just see the last one and we think, oh, well, that's what I'm trying to migrate from. That's my current gold standard. Instead of seeing all the way back and recognizing that, wow, there's a real gulf of time between me and when that original was. And even though I want to be faithful to that original, I don't really even understand the context of that or how to use it or why it looks that way. So I would say that migration sort of lulls us into not worrying about that, and emulation brings that to the fore. So it's a great point. The other thing I would say is that I don't believe that emulation is the answer for everything, and I do believe that reinterpretation, and this is where amateurs come in again, and other professionals that we cannot foresee yet, offers another way to reimagine works, a way that is more social. It's more of the way indigenous culture perseveres, and it's proliferative. And it doesn't worry so much about whether I'm faithful to some abstract notion of the original. It worries a little bit more about, is this doing useful social work? Is this actually activating communities? And I'm very fond of that form of preservation as well. So I think between the two, maybe we'll have that issue covered.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Chattelbash, Senior Archivist here at the Yale Center for British Art. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for coming to the symposium and to thank our speakers for their interesting and thought-provoking presentations. The symposium has addressed an important topic, and we really appreciate your participation. I'd like to end our event by thanking Kate Peebles for all the work she is doing as part of her National Digital Stewardship Residency. All right, you guys are going to have to repeat that in a second. And especially for her efforts organizing this symposium, I'd like to close the day by asking everyone to join me in giving her a round of applause.